Blackstone Publishing presents You'll See This Message When It Is Too Late. The Legal and Economic Aftermath of Cybersecurity Breaches by Josephine Wolff. This book is read by Kate Redding. All charts, diagrams, and photographs that appear in the print edition of this book can be found in the bonus PDF file that accompanies your audiobook CD or download. In memory of Sheila Solomon Class, who hated computers but loved writing. 1. Introduction. After the breach. Cybersecurity incidents have a short shelf life. As I write this in fall 2017, the breaches of the moment are the theft of the 145.5 million Americans' information from the credit bureau Equifax, the compromise of 3 billion Yahoo user accounts, and the Russian government's theft of sensitive National Security Agency documents from a government contractor's home computer. But by the time you read this, those incidents will have long since been eclipsed by dozens of other high-profile breaches. We read about the most recent data breaches in the headlines for a few days, maybe weeks, after they are publicly announced. We learn how many records were stolen, or the most embarrassing secrets revealed in the breach. We find out who will be fired and who will sue. And then these stories typically fade from our consciousness as they are overshadowed by newer, bigger, even more dramatic incidents. The most recent cybersecurity breaches grab our attention not just because they are breaking news, but also because there's a strong sense that the older incidents, the ones that happened a few months ago, or even worse, a few years ago, have nothing to teach us because they are already hopelessly out of date, and our adversaries have moved on to new tactics and technologies. Why waste time and resources learning how to defend against yesterday's attacks in the face of constantly evolving threats? But not everything about these attacks is changing. Certainly, the technical details and exploits can shift rapidly as attackers adapt their methods to root around defensive upgrades and patches. But many of the non-technical elements of these breaches have changed relatively little over the course of the past decade, since the early days of large-scale data breaches and organized cybercrime. The policies that govern how computer systems may be used and how they should be defended, the policing and law enforcement efforts aimed at tracking down perpetrators of security breaches, the motivations driving attackers and their ultimate goals, be those money, espionage, or publicly humiliating their victims, have all stayed fairly constant. Older security incidents offer a wealth of insight into how the current policy climate enables attackers' pursuit of their end goals, and how non-technical lines of defense can be better tailored to address cybercrimes. This book traces the trajectory of a series of significant cybersecurity incidents between 2005 and 2015, with particular attention focused on the aftermath of those events. Because cybersecurity incidents typically enjoy such a brief period of public attention, we often miss what happens after the perpetrators have successfully gained access to their target systems or data. Who sues whom? Who ends up paying whom? Who changes their security setup? Who attempts to dodge responsibility for future incidents? And how policymakers respond. While there has been significant work done on the technical components of the breaches discussed here, this book sets that technical material alongside a close analysis of the legal and economic fallout of these breaches. This juxtaposition highlights the ways we conclude breaches were caused by technical failings or simple human error, often overlooking the extent to which those failings are merely catalysts for longer-term political fights. Those fights involve a multitude of different stakeholders with different levers of power, and they continue to play out long after the technology has changed and improved. A poorly encrypted wireless network at a Marshall store in Miami gives rise to a lengthy, bitter battle between retailers, banks, and payment networks about who should be responsible for covering the costs of fraud and new security technologies. The compromise of Dutch certificate authority DigiNotar yields a years-long tussle between certificate authorities and browser vendors about who bears ultimate responsibility for vetting websites and how easily trust can be bought, sold, and revoked online. Even as our technologies continue to develop and evolve rapidly, these legal and political machinations follow much older, deeply entrenched templates that significantly impact the ways we choose to protect our computer systems and data. Studying the history of these incidents, and especially what follows them, sheds new light on the questions: what have we learned in the first 10 years we as a society have been seriously grappling with the challenges of large-scale data insecurity? And why haven't we gotten better at securing data and computer networks during that period? Surveying the brief history of cybersecurity incidents to identify the relatively more static elements of those breaches can inform our understanding of defender-attacker dynamics. The question of who has the advantage in cyber attacks, defenders or attackers, gives rise to two contradictory viewpoints. The traditional perspective is that attackers have the edge. Ross Anderson, for instance, writes, "Attack is simply easier than defense." Defending a modern information system could also be likened to defending a large, thinly populated territory, like the 19th century Wild West. The men in black hats can strike anywhere, while the men in white hats have to defend everywhere. This notion that defending all possible avenues of attack is more difficult than finding a single vulnerability in a computer system's defenses resonates with the technical dimensions of defense. It makes intuitive sense, given the diverse, ever-evolving set of possibilities for breaching technologies we rely on every day. However, in proposing their cyberattack kill chain model for dividing security breaches into a sequence of progressive stages, Eric Hutchins and his colleagues at Lockheed Martin, Michael Kloppert and Rohan Amin, contend just the opposite. The adversary must progress successfully through each stage of the chain before it can achieve its desired objective. Just one mitigation disrupts the chain and the adversary. Because of this, they argue, the defender can achieve an advantage over the aggressor. How to reconcile these competing, contradictory viewpoints? How can it be true both that defenders are always at a disadvantage because they have to defend everywhere, and that attackers are always at a disadvantage because they have to progress successfully through every stage of their planned attack to succeed? Which of these perspectives is applicable to any given incident or stage of an incident depends on a more nuanced assessment of the particular facts and structure of a given compromise. In this book, by revisiting major cybersecurity incidents of the early 21st century, we can start to define the circumstances under which each of these two framings of attacker and defender advantage is most useful, which stages and components of cybersecurity incidents are most susceptible to a well-placed intervention by defenders, and which stages require those defenders to block off so many parallel options and attack pathways that the attackers unquestioningly hold the upper hand. Or, put more simply, over the course of the life cycle of a cybersecurity incident, at what points is it most easily and effectively disrupted or prevented, and by whom? A central theme that emerges from this analysis is that the elements of these security incidents that are most susceptible to the kinds of interventions that cut off an entire stage of the attack and thereby halt the kill chain are often related to public policy and legal intervention. Meanwhile, the attack stages that, by contrast, most resemble the Wild West analogy and therefore provide attackers with the greatest advantage are those that relate to technical access to protected computer systems. Identifying the full range of possible opportunities for defensive intervention requires mapping out the entire sequence of events for a given cybersecurity incident. A 2011 study conducted by Kirill Levchenko and several collaborators looked at the best way to reduce commercial email spam by tracing what the authors called the spam message's click trajectory. This trajectory represented the full life cycle of the spammer's operations, beginning with sending spam emails, all the way through the messages being opened, the recipients clicking on the links in them, and the products advertised in them being purchased and shipped to customers. The researchers collected spam messages, visited the websites advertised in those messages, bought some of the pharmaceuticals, replica luxury goods, and counterfeit software sold through those sites, and at each stage of the spam value chain, analyzed the feasibility of trying to intervene to cut off the spammer's business. In particular, they looked for what they called bottlenecks, or opportunities for disrupting monetization at a stage where the fewest alternatives are available to spammers, and ideally for which switching cost is high as well. The researchers ultimately determined that rather than trying to take down the bots being used to send spam emails in bulk, or the hosting infrastructure underlying the websites those messages linked to, the most effective defensive intervention would be to crack down on the handful of banks that provided merchant services for the large majority of these transactions. That would entail encouraging the major global payment networks, such as Visa and MasterCard, not to allow certain types of transactions with the small number of banks known to be supporting spammers' enterprises. This stage of the spammers' process, the stage at which they processed customer credit card transactions, satisfied the characteristics of a bottleneck because so few banks were doing business with spammers. 95% of the transactions the researchers tracked were settled by the same 3 banks, and also because the switching cost associated with it was high for spammers, since setting up an account with a new bank would take days or even weeks. The researchers concluded their analysis by returning to the question of when and if the defender is ever at an advantage online, writing, "If U.S. issuing banks, i.e. banks that provide credit cards to U.S. consumers, were to refuse to settle certain transactions, for example, card-not-present transactions for a subset of merchant category codes, with the banks identified as supporting spam-advertised goods, then the underlying enterprise would be dramatically demonetized. Furthermore, it appears plausible that such a financial blacklist could be updated very quickly, driven by modest numbers of undercover buys, as in our study, and far more rapidly than the turnaround time to acquire new banking resources, a rare asymmetry favoring the anti-spam community." The analysis of past security incidents in this book is related in spirit to this analysis of the spam value chain. It is an opportunity to revisit these incidents with an eye to mapping out their entire trajectories and locating those rare asymmetries in favor of the defenders, the opportunities for intervention that constrain attackers by offering them the fewest and most costly alternative paths to achieve their ultimate goals. The subsequent case studies are analyzed with an eye to trying to identify similar bottlenecks in the life cycles of those incidents, or opportunities for especially effective defensive interventions that would require perpetrators to make expensive, slow adjustments to their original plans. The ultimate goals or motives of the perpetrators of security breaches are a central organizing theme of this analysis, in part because they remain relatively static over time, and in part because they largely dictate the final stages of such incidents. The three types of motives underlying computer security incidents explored here, financial gain, espionage, and public humiliation of the victims, often for the purposes of revenge or wreaking havoc, recur repeatedly throughout the brief history of cybersecurity breaches. While some incidents clearly belong to one of these categories, these classes of harm are not always clear-cut, nor are they always completely distinct. In particular, the goal of publicly humiliating a victim can take many forms, ranging from publishing all of a victim's internal information and communications, as in the case of Sony Pictures, to exposing a victim's customer base and highlighting their inadequate security, as in the case of adultery website Ashley Madison, to overwhelming their servers with traffic in hopes of driving away their customers, as in the case of Spam House. Here, this class of harm, broadly described as public humiliation or revenge, and discussed in the third section of the book, is used to encompass incidents that do not have a clear financial or espionage-related motive. Even then, these categories still sometimes overlap. A breach perpetrated primarily for the purposes of public humiliation, such as the breach of Sony Pictures, may still serve some espionage or even financial theft function, either for its perpetrators or for others who piggyback on their crime by exploiting the information that the attackers stole. Similarly, the architects of threats like the CryptoLocker ransomware may be motivated primarily by financial gain, but still sometimes share information they obtain with government officials for the purposes of espionage. Despite the challenges of assigning a single clear-cut motivation to any individual incident, this book is organized around these general classes of harm because they dictate the final stages of breaches. These are the stages at which perpetrators have the least flexibility and the fewest options for changing course, the stages which are often most susceptible to political, legal, and social interventions rather than technical tools and defenses, because they occur after the technical stages of a breach have been completed. Financial gain, espionage, and revenge are by no means the only motivations for cybersecurity incidents. The infamous Stuxnet worm, used to damage uranium enrichment centrifuges in Iran, illustrates yet another class of harm that can be imposed by such incidents: physical service disruption. This type of harm is certainly no less important, but there are too few known cases beyond Stuxnet to allow for much comparative or longitudinal analysis at this point. This classification of perpetrator motives is not meant to be exhaustive. Existing work on the mindset and perspective of hackers, especially by Gabriella Coleman, has identified several other motivations underlying cybercrimes beyond those discussed here, including political activism, curiosity, and personal entertainment. The categories used here are chosen not to illustrate the full range of factors that motivate people to commit crimes online, but rather to be instructive for defensive purposes by highlighting common attacker end goals and the individual stages of incidents that those attackers must complete in order to be successful. The purpose of this classification is to illuminate different possible opportunities for defensive intervention that specifically target perpetrators' ability to achieve their ultimate end goals, and this objective also motivates the case selection. The case studies presented here illustrate a range of different attack templates that perpetrators can follow, depending on their overarching motivations, as well as the variety of economic, legal, and political consequences that can be incurred by individual incidents. The cases were also chosen to span different groups of online stakeholders, from browser manufacturers to payment processors to DNS operators, in order to give a clearer picture of the incentives each group faces when it comes to online security, as well as how each set of stakeholders fits into a larger defensive ecosystem. Just as perpetrators' motives remain relatively constant, so too do the later stages of breaches that occur immediately before they achieve their ultimate goals. This consistency stands in stark contrast to the early technical phases of cybersecurity breaches, when perpetrators first attempt to gain access to their target computer systems. There is no set order of steps or template for how to go about accessing protected data or networks. Stealing credentials via phishing emails and malicious websites can be a means of stealing sensitive information, or, conversely, attackers may steal sensitive data-containing credentials as a means of accessing accounts to send phishing emails and spam. Similarly, stolen credentials can be used to deliver and install malware, or malware can be used to steal credentials. The potential circularity of these access capabilities makes it difficult for defenders to know where they are interfering in an attacker's plan, or indeed, what that adversary's ultimate intention is. It also grants adversaries considerable freedom to improvise and adjust course during these early stages of a breach, when capabilities can be so easily reordered and reassembled in response to defensive interventions. This freedom from a set sequence of steps diminishes, however, as attackers reach the later stages of these incidents and prepare to actually carry out their intended aim. Attackers' options, and correspondingly the number of pathways defenders must cover, narrow as adversaries get closer to their goal. There are many different ways for thieves to initiate the very early stages of a massive breach of payment card numbers, and defending against any one of those access modes individually may do little to hinder their progress, so long as there is another. By contrast, there are relatively fewer different ways to profit from stolen payment card numbers, so defenses aimed at that stage of a breach can be more narrowly focused. This work, especially where it looks at financially motivated security incidents, owes much to the growing literature on the economics of information security. In a 2012 paper, Anderson and several collaborators provide a thorough breakdown of the different types of costs incurred by cybercrimes and compare the current spending on preemptive data measures to indirect losses and spending on enforcement. Based on their estimates, they conclude, we should perhaps spend less in anticipation of computer crime, on antivirus, firewalls, etc., but we should certainly spend an awful lot more on catching and punishing the perpetrators. This important insight that the technical defenses against cybercrimes are overemphasized and receive disproportionate resources as compared to the non-technical mechanisms of law enforcement and policy making motivates much of this analysis. The case studies analyzed here, which range from large-scale data breaches resulting in financial fraud to state-sponsored espionage to data dumps intended to publicly shame specific companies and victims, examine not just the technical controls that might or might not have effectively prevented the incidents from occurring. They also look closely at the range of non-technical defenses that might have been used to interfere with the perpetrator's progress. 2 papers focused on the economics of privacy, both written by Sasha Romanowski and Alessandro Acquisti, also provide crucial background and motivation for this analysis. One of these papers, also co-authored with Rahul Telang, found that the passage of state data breach disclosure laws actually reduces the rate of identity theft by about 6.1%. This demonstration of the ability of policies to reduce negative security breach outcomes, one of relatively few attempts to quantify the impact of a computer security-related policy measure, shows the potential of policy measures to help defend against cybersecurity incidents. But it also highlights the many layers of challenges associated with internalizing the externalities of data breaches, given the number of different stakeholders involved. The effectiveness of data breach disclosure laws relies on actions taken by both firms and consumers, the authors point out, knowing that in the aftermath of breaches, many people affected ignore the letters notifying them of the breach, or never bother to sign up for the credit monitoring services offered to them. Firms can improve their controls. However, once notified, consumers themselves are expected to take responsibility to reduce their own risk of identity theft, something which only a minority appears to be doing, the researchers conclude. Another article by Romanowski and Acquisti, looking at personal data protection and the costs associated with loss of privacy, classifies policy measures as falling into 3 categories: ex-ante safety regulations, ex-post liability, and information disclosure, and compares the effectiveness of each type of measure for protecting consumer data. They note that all 3 mechanisms are inefficient in different ways, arguing, only in rare and extreme cases will any of these policy approaches be able to achieve the socially optimal outcome. This highlights both the advantages and the drawbacks of each individual type of security policy, from policies that impose baseline protection measures, to those that impose liability regimes, to those that simply require victims to be notified of breaches of their personal data. Each of these forms of policy, individually, is inadequate and inefficient in some regards. This finding motivates the discussion of these case studies, spanning both the preventive measures taken by targeted firms and the ex-post lawsuits and settlements used to distribute costs in their aftermath. Looking at the strengths and weaknesses of each of these types of policy in the context of specific breaches allows for a clearer understanding of how they can be deployed in concert and used to bolster each other. The theoretical framework used to analyze the cases presented here borrows not just from research on kill chain modeling, the bottleneck stages of cybersecurity incidents, and the need to balance ex-ante and ex-post defenses in these situations, but also from theories drawn from law and international relations scholarship. The analysis of the legal fallout of the incidents examined here and their impact on individuals owes much to the work done by Daniel Solov and Danielle Citron, exploring the many different ways that data breaches can harm victims beyond straightforward financial losses. The exploration of espionage incidents and the motivations behind nation-states that conduct cyber espionage for political and economic purposes builds on the impressive body of work by Ronald Diebert, who, together with colleagues at the University of Toronto Citizen Lab, has uncovered details of numerous online espionage and surveillance campaigns and argued persuasively that there is less and less transparency, accountability, and oversight surrounding these sorts of online activities. Thomas Ridd's work on the distinctions between cyber war, cyber espionage, and cyber sabotage has also been invaluable in parsing the various motivations of perpetrators and understanding their political implications. Important work by Martin Libicki, as well as Brandon Valeriano and Ryan Manes, on the international relations dimensions of cyber conflict and the reasons national governments may exercise restraint when it comes to cyber operations, has also shaped the discussion of security incidents attributed to state actors, including the DigiNotar compromise, the PLA Unit 61398 espionage attempts, the OPM breach, and the Sony Pictures breach. For thinking about cybersecurity incidents from the perspective of individual targeted organizations, Scott Shackelford's work on the potential to improve accountability for cybersecurity through polycentric regulation has provided crucial insights on the interplay of economics, law, and policy in an international business context. Policy and the role it can play in defending against computer-based threats is a central theme of this book, but the Internet spans many nations and is therefore subject to many different and sometimes contradictory policy regimes instituted by countries across the world. Each of these countries has its own ideas about what would make the Internet more secure and its own individual set of laws and policy-making processes. While the incidents discussed in this book span several countries, from Iran to the Netherlands to Russia to North Korea, the policy analysis of how lawmakers could help prevent or mitigate such incidents in the future is largely focused on the United States. Many of these recommendations may be relevant or applicable to other countries, but the specific agencies, laws, and court proceedings cited here are drawn for the most part from the U.S. system. There are several reasons for this focus on U.S. policy. It would not be practical to tackle every nation's cybersecurity policies in a single book, nor does every nation share a common view of what constitutes cybersecurity, making it more difficult to draw direct comparisons between their policies. For instance, in both Russia and China, there are several cybersecurity policies primarily concerned with ensuring that the national government is capable of accessing information about its citizens' online activities. As a case in point, in July 2017, Russia passed a law banning virtual private networks, often used to protect online users' anonymity. And in June 2016, it passed the so-called Yarovaya law, requiring telephone and Internet service providers to store user data for 6 months and assist intelligence agencies with decrypting that data. In November 2016, China passed a cybersecurity law requiring that information about Chinese citizens be stored on servers in China and not transferred abroad without permission, a measure that might hinder foreign governments from accessing the information, but would almost certainly ensure that the Chinese government could access it as needed. The United States also has surveillance laws, but the focus of this book is on policies that govern defense against cybercrimes, not policies that regulate government access to data. While the U.S. government has not always pursued cybercrime policies focused on industry defense initiatives, especially aggressively, it has done so to a greater extent than many other countries, making the U.S. a useful starting point for analysis. In 2016, the European Union passed 2 policies aimed at strengthening cybersecurity: the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, and the Network and Information Security Directive, NISD. Both policies are aimed at setting baseline cybersecurity requirements and instituting new incident reporting requirements for companies, though the former is more focused on giving individuals greater control over their data, while the latter targets the protection of critical IT infrastructure. These are precisely the sorts of policy undertakings examined in this book, but it is still too early to know with any confidence how such measures will play out in practice. As of this writing, the GDPR has not yet gone into effect, and EU member states still have several months to implement the NISD by passing individual national laws that will lay out the specifics of how the directive will be interpreted and enforced in each country, and which companies it will apply to within their borders. Clearly, as demonstrated by events in 2016 and 2017, many countries are turning their attention to the question of how to tackle cybersecurity challenges through policy, and, for better or worse, they have few precedents on which to model their efforts besides the United States. Beyond its potential to shape other countries' policymaking efforts, U.S. cybersecurity policy is also important because it can have a disproportionate global influence on cybercrime, given how many major online content providers, payment processors, hardware manufacturers, software companies, and Internet service providers are based in the United States. Regulations aimed at leveraging or incentivizing these entities' defensive capabilities could have significant consequences that reach far beyond the borders of the United States. That does not mean the United States can, on its own, tackle cybercrime any more than any other country. Any truly comprehensive policy approach to dealing with online crime and espionage would undoubtedly require extensive international cooperation and partnership. Certainly, there is no other way to reliably identify and hold responsible the people perpetrating these crimes, who operate irrespective of national borders. But in the past, governments have too often used that as an excuse for not taking any serious unilateral action, even when carefully crafted, rigorously enforced policies aimed at intermediaries operating within those governments' own borders might have a profound impact. Evaluating the existing U.S. policies that aim to do this, and where they fall short, provides an opportunity for thinking through both the limitations of any individual country's ability to regulate the Internet, as well as the real opportunities afforded to a national government trying to crack down on cybercrime and espionage within its borders. At a moment when many governments are interested in the question of how they can better defend computer systems and data through policymaking, they may all be able to learn something about what works and what doesn't from observing the efforts of the United States. By assessing security incidents across their entire life cycles, this work incorporates discussion of many different types of defenses and potential defenders, not just as they operate in isolation, but also, more significantly, in terms of their relationship to and interactions with each other. There is widespread consensus among information security experts that information systems should be secured through a combination of multiple different controls, a principle sometimes referred to as defense in depth. But the guidance governing how best to conjoin and layer such controls is often ambiguous and has focused almost exclusively on the combinations of technical defense measures that can be implemented by individual actors. Little attention has been paid to the range of technical and non-technical defenses that can be set up across different types of organizations with varying capabilities and motivations. Coordinating defenses across different stakeholders introduces significant new logistic challenges, but it also affords new insights into what it could mean to implement a comprehensive approach to computer security that incorporated every component of the network and addressed every stage of an attack. Reconstructing the chain of events for individual cybersecurity incidents is relatively easier to do for older incidents than more recent ones. When breaches are first discovered and announced, often little is known about how they were carried out, or even what motivated them. Moreover, the involved parties may be wary of revealing any more details than absolutely necessary for fear of fueling negative publicity and lawsuits. It takes time for investigators to track down the root causes of major cybersecurity incidents, and it often takes even more time for the people involved in those investigations to be willing to talk publicly about their results, or for those findings to appear in court filings and public records. This is one advantage of revisiting older breaches. It is possible to reconstruct much more detailed timelines and chains of events for attacks, and in doing so, shed light on where attackers had the fewest options for moving forward and which defenders might have been best poised to prevent their success. Most importantly, revisiting past cybersecurity incidents allows us to trace how all of the different parties involved in the incident, from the targeted organizations to software manufacturers, internet service providers, banks, web hosts, government agencies, and individuals, divvy up the cleanup costs and the blame afterwards. Tracking who gets held accountable in the aftermath of these incidents allows us to reconceptualize who is capable of being a defender and how. All of the groups and people who play some role in enabling successful cybersecurity incidents, whether that role is opening a phishing email, or writing vulnerable code, or conveying malicious traffic between computers, or settling financial transactions, or setting regulatory security guidelines, are potential defenders, in that they are capable of exercising certain types of controls and restrictions over attackers that are not available to anyone else. Often the fallout of these breaches profoundly shapes the interactions among all these different intermediaries and defenders. It thereby influences the ecosystem of computer system defense long after the breaches themselves have faded from the headlines, the responsible CEOs have been fired, and the lawsuits have been settled. In large part, what we learn from these breaches is how the dynamics between different defenders, or stakeholders who could potentially serve as defenders in some capacity, have shaped the security landscape we have today. In the aftermath of these incidents, we see how their fallout engenders hostilities between parties who should, ostensibly, be on the same side, and above all, strengthens the resolve of all involved not to be held responsible for any piece of anyone else's security. Much of what becomes clear in the aftermath of breaches is how complicated and ill-defined the liability regimes for these incidents are, and how that translates into everyone trying to shift blame onto each other, and no one being willing to take on even some small piece of the overall defensive posture, lest they end up shouldering the entire responsibility alone. The collective action and coordination problems that plague the groups involved in defending against breaches are not unique to cybersecurity incidents, but they are exacerbated by an environment where so many different people and firms are so deeply interconnected, and no data flows through only one party's systems, software, or devices. The interdependence and interrelatedness of the computer systems that are targeted in these breaches adds to the technical complexity of defending them. It also adds to the complexity of non-technical security efforts by broadening the number of people and organizations involved in defense. Different types of organizations and defenders, from software developers to system administrators to policymakers, are able to influence and intervene at very different stages of security breaches. Each individual defender has a limited scope of control that is crucial for understanding which defensive responsibilities they can reasonably and realistically be expected to assume. When we talk about and report on and litigate successful security incidents, too often our inclination is to latch on to the first or the most easily understood point of access: the phishing email, the dictionary attack, the unprotected wireless network, and harp on the simple line defense that seems like it would have made all the difference: two-factor authentication, or rate-limiting logins, or better encryption of network traffic. But that perspective oversimplifies the much more complicated narrative of the gradual, escalating capabilities acquired by perpetrators, as well the much more limited and challenging environment in which individual defenders operate. The purpose of this book is to broaden and complicate that picture of who is, and should be, responsible for defending against cybersecurity incidents, and to explore why answering that question has proved so difficult and requires more assertive policymaking. This book is organized in 4 sections. The first section looks at 3 case studies of financially motivated cybercrimes and uses them to trace 3 overlapping waves of economic models: payment card fraud, as seen through the lens of the TJX breach of 2006, identity theft and tax fraud, illustrated by the 2012 South Carolina Department of Revenue breach, and the rise of ransomware and crimes focused on selling stolen data back to the victims, as viewed through the 2014 takedown of the Game Over Zeus botnet, used to distribute the ransomware program CryptoLocker. The second section focuses on 3 incidents of cyber espionage: the 2011 compromise of Dutch certificate authority DigiNotar to access the email of Iranian individuals, the attempts by Chinese People's Liberation Army Unit 61398 to conduct espionage on U.S.-based companies from 2006 through 2014, and the 2015 breach of the United States Office of Personnel Management, OPM. This section focuses especially on the limited ability of ex-post litigation to settle the costs of breaches when there is no clear financial harm to victims. It also explores the range of other available ex-post mitigations to address espionage harms, from relocating overseas spies, as was done in the case of the OPM breach, to re-engineering the responsibilities and transparency of the Internet's global certificate-based trust infrastructure, as in the case of the DigiNotar breach. The third section looks at 3 incidents motivated by the perpetrator's desire to take revenge on the victims: the large-scale denial-of-service attacks directed against Spamhaus in 2013, the public dump of data stored on Sony Pictures servers in 2014, and the 2015 breach of the Ashley Madison website, owned by Avid Life Media. These incidents provide a window into the opportunities for intermediaries to intervene in non-financial breaches. They also elucidate the considerable challenges associated with trying to defend against the final stages of breaches in which the perpetrator's sole interest, with regard to their stolen information or unauthorized access, is to make it publicly available as widely as possible, rather than exploit it for financial or political purposes. The fourth and final section shifts from considering case studies to looking at the capabilities of 3 groups of stakeholders: application designers, organizations that store and protect data, and policymakers. This section considers the roles each group is equipped to play in defending against such breaches in the future. It closes with recommendations for how they can best leverage their own strengths both singly and collectively, rather than just working to abdicate responsibility to other parties. At a superficial level, all of the breaches discussed in this book can be traced back to technical failings, poor encryption, improperly configured firewalls, or out-of-date software, and in some cases, also to careless users who made the mistake of clicking on a phishing email, or opening an attachment, or failing to change default passwords. But improving computer security is not just a matter of improving technical capabilities and tools, nor is it only about improving user education and awareness, though both of these things are undoubtedly important. It's also, fundamentally, a matter of defining clear roles and responsibilities for the actors positioned to prevent and protect against security breaches, and figuring out how to do that in a way that leverages those bottleneck opportunities for effective interventions that offer defenders an edge over attackers. This is every bit as difficult as developing more secure technology, perhaps more difficult in some instances, but it is challenging in very different ways. Figuring out how to apportion responsibility for security across all the different actors involved in developing, maintaining, and providing service to a single computer system requires its own kind of sophisticated engineering and skillful design. Difficult as they may be to implement, these tactics are crucial for defense, because they often address the most stable, least rapidly evolving elements of cybersecurity incidents, the ones that don't become immediately obsolete as attackers refine and adapt their methods. Given the understandable reluctance of any private parties to unilaterally shoulder greater security responsibilities, these are challenges that ultimately require the intervention and attention of policymakers, courts, and governments. What the relatively brief but rich history of cybersecurity incidents in the early 21st century teaches us is that ultimately these incidents are not failures of our technology, but instead failures to craft clear and effective liability regimes, failures to assign responsibility and blame for breaches in ways that appreciate and take advantage of the technical complexity and interconnectedness of the Internet, and failures to accept that cybersecurity is as much a problem of hastily written out-of-date laws and policies as it is hastily written out-of-date code. Part 1. Lessons from Financially Motivated Cybercrimes. 2. Operation Get Rich or Die Tryin', how the TJX breach set the stage for a decade of payment card conflict. In July 2005, Albert Gonzalez, Damon Patrick Toohey, and Christopher Scott started taking war-driving expeditions along the South Dixie Highway in Miami. Armed with a laptop and a large radio antenna, the three friends, all in their 20s, tested the wireless signals of the businesses they drove past, looking for vulnerable wireless networks that they could connect to and use to intercept potentially valuable packets. Packets are the units of data transmitted across the Internet. When information is sent between different computers online, it is broken into multiple packets, each of which contains information about the source and destination address, as well as part of the transmitted content. The packets are individually transmitted across the network to their destination, so when Gonzalez and his co-conspirators were eavesdropping on wireless networks, they collected lots of packets being sent across those networks and put them together to obtain information. They found what they were looking for at a Marshall's clothing store, part of a chain owned by TJX Companies Incorporated, the same company that owns TJ Maxx. connecting to the wireless network of that Marshall store in Miami, set in motion the lengthy and highly profitable data breach that Gonzalez, Toohey, Scott, and their co-conspirators carried out against TJX, a data breach that was revealed in 2007 to have resulted in the compromise of 45.7 million payment card numbers belonging to TJX customers, as well as the theft of hundreds of millions of dollars. And that breach, as well as others like it, in turn set in motion an extended and bitter battle over who should bear the costs of payment card fraud and who was responsible for preventing it, a fight that did as much to hinder attempts to reduce financial fraud as it did to hasten the arrival of more secure payment card technologies. In order to pull off what was at the time the largest known data breach in terms of number of records stolen, the team of criminals led by Gonzalez took advantage of a number of security vulnerabilities and oversights, of which the poor encryption of one retail store's wireless network was only the first. Yet, it was the encryption of that wireless network that drew the greatest scrutiny and criticism in the aftermath of the breach, when several press reports on the incident featured headlines that emphasized the pivotal role of the wireless network, such as "How Credit Card Data Went Out the Wireless Door" and "TJX's Failure to Secure Wi-Fi Could Cost $1 billion" and "Blame for Record-Breaking Credit Card Data Theft Laid at the Feet of WEP." WEP, or Wired Equivalent Privacy, was the encryption protocol used to protect the network traffic of the Marshall store that Gonzalez, Toohey, and Scott found while war driving. WEP was known to be vulnerable to attack and less secure than the newer WPA, or Wi-Fi Protected Access, encryption protocol. But TJX had not yet updated the wireless security at that particular Marshall store at the time of the breach. WEP and WPA are both forms of encryption, but at the time of the TJX compromise, researchers had discovered that WEP encryption could be relatively easily broken. Therefore, WPA was considered preferable, and in fact an even more secure version of WPA, called WPA2, was recommended beginning in 2006. However, many older devices could not be configured for WPA or WPA2, so WEP continued to be widely used for years after FBI agents publicly demonstrated its vulnerabilities at an Information Systems Security Association meeting in Los Angeles in 2005. Undoubtedly, that was a mistake. A serious, important, costly mistake. But it was not the only mistake that enabled the breach and subsequent fraud, nor was it necessarily the critical mistake that, had it not been made, would have averted the breach entirely. To blame an extended international multi-stage financial fraud operation on a single poorly protected wireless network is to fundamentally misunderstand how many different steps are involved in carrying out what Gonzalez and his co-conspirators achieved, and to vastly oversimplify the task of defending against such breaches. But it was no accident or mere misunderstanding that led to the formulation and dissemination of the enduring lesson of the TJX breach, that businesses should upgrade from WEP to WPA. Rather, it was the result of a concerted payment card industry effort to place blame for the incident squarely on the shoulders of a specific actor, TJX, due to a specific action, failing to update wireless encryption. Various parties had strong motivations to identify a specific single locus of blame in the aftermath of the TJX breach. Reporters wanted to offer a satisfying explanation of what had happened to curious readers. The individuals, banks, and payment card networks suing TJX to recoup the fraud losses resulting from the breach, wanted to make it clear that it was solely the retailer's fault this had happened, not anyone else's. Even TJX itself may have been relieved to be able to pinpoint a specific technical problem so that it could then reassure customers the wireless encryption had been fixed and its systems were now secure. The real legacy of the TJX breach lay not in teaching businesses to update their wireless security, but instead in teaching stakeholders the benefits of rushing to assign blame for a security breach to a particular failed technical mechanism implemented by an individual entity. A closer look at the full timeline of the TJX breach reveals that the episode in fact involved several different technical vulnerabilities and companies, but by singling out one encryption protocol and one organization as fully responsible for the incident, the payment card industry was able to effectively shield itself from bearing any of the blame. It was a lesson that would continue to shape the industry for years, long after Gonzalez and several of his co-conspirators had been arrested and imprisoned. In the decade following the TJX breach, the different sectors involved in the payment card industry, from retailers to banks to payment networks, expended tremendous effort and resources in trying to shift liability for security breaches and fraud onto each other, even as they often resisted implementing the newest, most secure versions of payment technologies. Technical stages of the TJX compromise. The Miami Marshall Stores wireless network was vulnerable in two ways that mattered to Gonzalez and his co-conspirators. For one, it allowed Open System Authentication, OSA, instead of shared key authentication, which would have required devices to provide a shared key before they were permitted to join the network. Under OSA, anyone can connect any device to a wireless network, even without a password or key. This meant Gonzalez and his co-conspirators were able to join the store's network easily, just by sitting in the parking lot within range of the wireless signal. However, the traffic between devices on those networks was encrypted with WEP, so the thieves could join the network and monitor the encrypted traffic freely, but if they wanted to decrypt and understand it, they needed a decryption key. This posed an obstacle to the intruders, but not an insurmountable one. An attack discovered in 2001 showed that it was possible to derive the key from large volumes of collected WEP wireless traffic. Using a packet sniffer program designed by his friend Stephen Watt to collect the packets on the Marshall's wireless network, Gonzalez captured the encrypted traffic in bulk and analyzed it in order to discover the decryption key. Packet sniffers capture the contents of packets traveling across a network. The decrypted data included store officials' passwords and account information, which enabled the conspirators to access different computer servers containing payment card data within the TJX corporate network, as well as track-to data, the information found on the magnetic stripes of credit and debit cards. Using the employee credentials they had decrypted off the original Miami store's network, Gonzalez's team was then able to connect to the TJX corporate servers in Framingham, Massachusetts. With access to the corporate servers established, Scott and another member of the group, Jonathan James, rented rooms near the Marshall's store and used a 6-foot radio antenna to capture the store's signal from their hotel so as not to attract attention by spending hours in the parking lot. At one point in 2005, James had actually been arrested in Florida for sitting in a car in a retail store parking lot with Scott in the middle of the night with their laptop and antenna. From their hotel room, The two men could capture not just the bank card information for transactions processed in the single store in Miami, but also the Track-2 data for tens of millions of credit and debit cards used in transactions at the thousands of stores operated by TJX worldwide. Card data from transactions prior to 2004 had been stored in clear text, that is, it was not encrypted, but the information relating to more recent transactions was encrypted due to a change in TJX security practices. Concerned that the older information would be less valuable, since those cards were more likely to have expired, or be closer to expiring, than the ones used to make more recent purchases, Gonzalez enlisted help from accomplices in Eastern Europe to decrypt the newer data. This encryption added a considerable hurdle. On May 27, 2006, Gonzalez wrote in an online chat, "It took me 2 years to open PIN numbers, from OMX, Office Max," adding, "2 years from the time I hacked them to download all data to find proper decryption method." Since 2 years is half the lifespan of an average credit card, this delay would have been a serious setback for Gonzalez and his team. However, while downloading the encrypted data from the TJX servers, they had discovered that while a transaction was being processed, for a brief moment between the time when a card was swiped and the moment when the credit card company network approved it, that card's data was available unencrypted on the TJX payment card transaction processing server. So in May 2006, Gonzalez repurposed Watt's custom packet sniffer to capture the unencrypted card information at this exact moment, obviating the need for time-intensive decryption. The conspirators then began capturing the unencrypted card data and compressing it into files stored on the TJX corporate servers, which they could then download through their access to the Miami Marshalls store. To relieve their dependence on the Marshalls access point, in May 2006, the group established a VPN connection between the TJX corporate payment processing server and a server in Latvia, controlled by Gonzalez. A VPN, or virtual private network, is a service that allows users to create a secure private network while using a public or insecure Internet connection. When connected to a VPN, all of a user's traffic is encrypted and channeled through the VPN provider's servers, so that it is impossible for the operator of a public network, in this case TJX, to know what that user is doing online when connected to their network. By using a VPN, Gonzalez made it harder for TJX to figure out what was happening on its own servers, because they could not directly observe the exfiltration of payment card data to Latvia, since that was happening through the VPN provider. During the latter half of 2006, Gonzalez downloaded the unencrypted card data from millions of transactions in TJX stores all over the world directly to his server in Latvia. Gonzalez had successfully acquired tens of millions of credit and debit card details, but he still didn't have what he really wanted: money. Technical tools and capabilities had gotten him this far, but in order to turn stolen information into stolen money, Gonzalez had to move beyond the confines of the TJX computer systems. From bits to barrels of cash. There is little doubt that Gonzalez's primary motivations were financial. He nicknamed the series of credit card theft breaches that included the TJX compromise Operation Get Rich or Die Tryin', and told one of his co-conspirators in an online chat on March 7, 2006, "I have a goal. I want to buy a yacht. Once I reach my goal, I won't be doing anything illegal." After Gonzalez was apprehended, Secret Service agents found a barrel containing $1.2 million in cash buried in his parents' backyard. But his desire to profit financially constrained Gonzalez's options following the technical stages of the breach. There were any number of ways Gonzalez might have chosen to exploit technical vulnerabilities in the TJX computer systems to steal payment card data. He happened to take advantage of wireless network encryption, packet sniffers, and VPN access. But similar such breaches have been perpetrated using a range of other tools, from phishing emails to malware delivered by USB drive. Once Gonzalez had the data in hand, however, there were only a very limited number of ways to profit from it. To turn his cache of stolen payment card numbers into hard cash, Gonzalez enlisted the help of Maxim Yastremsky, a Ukrainian black market card seller who operated a popular website selling stolen payment cards. Buyers would wire money to Yastremsky, who would then send them the purchased card information. Yastremsky paid Gonzalez using ATM cards linked to accounts set up in Latvia. These cards were delivered to cashers, who were responsible for withdrawing the money from the Latvian accounts and then sending the cash, less a 10% commission, to Gonzalez's drop box in Miami. Sometimes Gonzalez would also send couriers to collect cash directly from Yastremsky's partners. Humza Zaman, a firewall security specialist at Barclays, who acted as both a courier and casher, later testified that he was responsible for laundering approximately $700,000 for Gonzalez. In December 2006, a credit card company noticed that several compromised cards were linked to TJX stores and alerted the company to a possible breach. On the advice of law enforcement officials, the company waited a month to alert customers in hopes of being able to trace the thieves before scaring them off with a public announcement. TJX hired General Dynamics and IBM to conduct an investigation of the compromise, an investigation that did not go unnoticed by Gonzalez. In fact, he decided to shut down the exfiltration of TJX information when he came close to having his own system infiltrated by General Dynamics. He wrote by way of explanation, "After those faggots at General Dynamics almost owned me while I was owning TJX, I don't want to risk anything." The TJX investigation did not succeed in finding the responsible parties, but many of those involved, including Gonzalez, Yastremsky, Scott, Watt, James, and Zaman, were later identified following Yastremsky's capture in a nightclub in Turkey in July 2007. In Yastremsky's chat logs, Secret Service agents found the username of someone who had been supplying many of the stolen card numbers. They could not immediately identify whose username it was, but the same person had asked Yastremsky to provide a fake passport to help a cashier who had recently been arrested leave the country. The investigators figured out that the anonymous supplier was Jonathan Williams, one of Gonzalez's cashiers, who had recently been arrested while carrying $200,000 in cash and 80 blank debit cards. Searching a thumb drive that Williams had on him at the time of his arrest, the Secret Service found a photo of Gonzalez, his credit report, and the address of his sister Maria, materials Williams said were meant to serve as insurance against Gonzalez ever informing on him. The investigators traced the cash Williams was in charge of delivering to a P.O. box in Miami, registered to Jonathan James, and then discovered an arrest record for James from 2005, when he had been found late at night in a store parking lot, sitting in a car with another man named Christopher Scott, along with laptops and a huge radio antenna. Finally, the Secret Service tracked down the registration information for the chat username of Yastremski's major supplier and linked the email address, soupnazi@efnet.ru, to the online alias Gonzalez was known to use, Soup Nazi. Gonzalez was arrested on May 7, 2008, at the National Hotel in Miami Beach. The stages of the TJX breach that ultimately led to the identification and arrest of Gonzalez and his conspirators were not technical in nature. They had little to do with how data was stolen from the TJX servers, and everything to do with how that data was used to steal money. Not coincidentally, these were the stages of the breach where Gonzalez had the fewest options about how to proceed. While he was stealing data, he and his team could improvise and find new ways of accessing the information they wanted, like using the packet sniffer to intercept transaction data in real time. But he had only one way to make money from that information: by selling it. In doing so, he relied not on any technical obfuscation or defense, but rather on the international legal framework he believed would protect Yastremski from being apprehended by law enforcement officials. Since Ukraine has no extradition policy with the United States, Gonzalez figured both Yastremski and by extension he himself were safe from U.S. investigators. "I never thought Yastremski would leave Ukraine," Gonzalez told reporter James Verini about his decision to sell the stolen data through Yastremski's operation. While the early stages of the TJX breach were enabled by multiple technical vulnerabilities, the later stages, the ones in which money was actually stolen and victims actually suffered, were primarily enabled by policy decisions. Gonzalez's eventual identification and prosecution were similarly only made possible by the policy of extradition between Turkey and the United States that allowed Yastremski to be apprehended during his visit to the Turkish seaside resort of Kemer. The role of laws and policies in enabling the TJX breach was not merely incidental. It was an explicit component of Gonzalez's mental calculus. He deliberately chose to sell his stolen card numbers through someone located in a country he believed was beyond the reach of U.S. law enforcement, and it was ultimately Yastremski's geographic choices that allowed laws and policies to catch up to him. Resolving the question of who or what is to blame for Gonzalez's success in perpetrating the TJX breach is not nearly so straightforward as simply pointing to the wireless network or even pointing to TJX. These may have seemed the obvious culprits in the immediate aftermath of the breach's discovery in 2007, but in the months and years that followed, as lawsuits were filed between the involved parties and more details of the incident came to light, it became increasingly clear that there had been several opportunities for interrupting Gonzalez's scheme, both by technical means and through policy measures. Some of these were opportunities that TJX could or should have taken advantage of, but others were not. Indeed, some of the interventions that Gonzalez seemed to view as most threatening to his plans were well beyond the scope of TJX's power, suggesting that the retailer may not even have been in the best strategic position to mitigate the large-scale fraud operation.